I'm going to give you some information, and at the conclusion of that, if we have time, I'd like to entertain some questions. I find that a lot of times when we have these types of presentations and conversations, questions are raised and people feel reluctant to ask those questions. So for the sake of everybody's clarity, this is a space in which you can ask those questions. I'm not here as your black friend. I'm not here necessarily as a black man. I'm here as an expert in structural racism. It is now appropriate for you to ask those questions. It's not appropriate for you to ask those questions of people who have been minoritized. Membership in a category of minoritization does not equate with expertise. Fair? All right. Some of you may not like what I have to say, and that's okay too. I would ask you to think about why it is that you don't like it. I had a conversation earlier with somebody in one of the breakout sessions where I pointed out that there are things that can be said by one person that when the identical thing is said by somebody else, it becomes a problem. Maybe this isn't the thing. This is not the thing. Down? Oh, see? She was right to praise you earlier. You are keeping this thing running. You are the glue. Thank you, Amber. Down. All right, we'll start with this. So I'm going to be looking at my little screens up here because I don't have this screen down here to look at. So racism, I'm going to define as the belief that races are groups whose physical differences are the foundation for significant cultural and social differences. And this is the key, that those differences are innate, measurable, and hierarchical. It also requires the subjugation of those races deemed inferior. Two different types of racism. Actually, Sunshine asked me a question about this earlier. There's popular sentiment that people of color, black people particularly, cannot be racist. That's a conversation that I've had. I welcome that conversation. The answer that I will provide is that it depends on the type of racism we're talking about. Right? By the definition of individual racism that I have provided for you, conscious or unconscious action based by a person based on a racial ideology, then of course, any human being can be racist in an individual capacity. But when we're talking about institutional racism, which I define as the interactions between institutions across time and space that serve to perpetuate that racial inequality, then no. Because there's a power component that's necessary that black people in this country simply don't have. Structural racism, a system in which laws, policies, institutions, practices perpetuate racial inequity. It does not require intentionally racist actions. It's a consequence of policies and practices that exist. In this way, a person can legitimately believe themselves not to be a racist person and not be a racist person, but they still absolutely are benefited by a system that is. I'm going to explain to you how the system was created, why it was created, and how we are where we are. As a sociologist, I understand the world as a social construction. The very way we interact with one another, reality itself is a social construction. Somebody show me a 4. Somebody show me a 4. Okay, so is that a 4? No, that's a symbol. Show me a 4, an actual 4. We all understand that 4 is the whole integer between 3 and 5. We all have that same understanding, but there's no such thing as a 4. We have symbols for what that 4 means, right? If everyone doesn't agree on what a symbol means, we're going to have difficulties. Here recently, there's been a lot of feelings hurt, a lot of ruffled feathers over people kneeling or standing for the anthem and the flag, right? The anthem and the flag of this country are symbols, and they are perceived differently by different people. They mean different things to different people. You're going to have contestation over what those values are. Some people think one thing and believe that very fervently, that everybody should believe that they do, but that's just not the way our world works, right? Reality itself is a social construction. Race is part of that, right? Racial formation is the socio-historical process by which categories are created, inhabited, transformed, and destroyed. It's alive, it moves, it changes, it's a moving target. Whoopi Goldberg took well-deserved heat recently for claiming that people of the Jewish race, for claiming that Jews are not a race. So now our understanding of race would indicate that people of the Jewish faith are not indeed a race. But in 1930s Germany, in 1930s Europe, when the Third Reich was in power, Jewish people were absolutely a race of their own. They experienced racism. It's changed across those years, right? It's people like race to fit in this neat little box. We can understand it and put it over here, and it is what it is, but that's not true. It moves and it changes. Race is a social construction. It's not real, any more than the 4 is real. But it's absolutely real in its consequences. The consequences of being assigned into a racial group are absolutely real. So in the beginning of this country, Africans and poor Europeans, and it's important to note that, right? Because they were brought here. When European colonists arrived here, they came of their own volition. They weren't the poor folks. They were brought here as indentured servants to fill the void created by the failure of indigenous enslavement. So when the colonists first arrived here, they realized this land was ripe with natural resources. There weren't enough of them to work it themselves, so they tried to get the indigenous folks to work it, and that didn't work. Why? Because they understood the land and the lay of it better than the geography, better than the people that came here, so they just left. So they started bringing people over, both from Africa and from Europe, as indentured servants. Pretty soon they realized that what would happen if they just didn't give people their freedom. Indentured servitude, for those who don't know, is a contract. I'm going to come and work for you for X amount of time for free. You'll provide me a place to live and sustenance. I'm going to work for you, and at the end of that period of time, I'll be excused, maybe with some money, maybe without some money, and I'll be able to branch out on my own. So what happened if those people weren't released? Nothing. If you arrived on a ship from Africa and you were in, I don't know, Illinois, Kentucky, Missouri, South Carolina, Florida, do you know where you are? Even if you knew where you were and you knew how to get home, do you own a ship? They were stuck. People realized that they didn't have to give people their freedom. They didn't have to keep their word. There were no consequences for not doing so. So the institution of enslavement, as we understand it in this country, was born. People realized pretty quickly that incredible amounts of money were being generated. But how do we support that? How do we make sure that these people remain motivated? Well, we can use physical violence, sexual violence, psychological violence to ensure that they remain properly motivated to work. But how do we justify that? We need to put together a system that justifies the continuing enslavement of some groups of people. But why use race? Why do we use race? Why not some other differentiator? Why not gender? Why not religion? Well, they tried religion at first, right? People were allowed to be enslaved because they weren't Christian. Well, it didn't take people very long to figure out if they said that they were Christians, and they couldn't be enslaved anymore. We need something that's visible. What better way? You can look around the room and you can see who's white and who isn't. It's pretty clear. None of you thought that I was a white dude when I walked up here, right? It's pretty clear. In fact, it's genius. Because you can look across your land and you can see who's supposed to be doing what. You don't need to go over there and see in person, but you can see that this person over here should not be associating with that person over there. So we instituted the slave codes, a set of laws by which black people are controlled and subjugated. It's a legal framework for the supremacy of the planter class. Now, I take you back to what I said about poor people. Understand that the planter elite were rich, white men. That's who they were. Those are the people that founded this country. Not all white folks, but rich, white dudes, as I like to tell people. Now, does that mean that any white men in this room that may happen to be wealthy are responsible for the condition of race relations in this country today? Of course not. But understand that when this country was created, that's who created it. They made the rules, they made the laws, and they did it to advantage themselves. The secondary part of the slave codes is that it outlined a second set of rules by which social interaction was regulated. Because if you're going to make sure that people are treated in an inhumane way, so they're able to generate obscene amounts of revenue for you, we can't have those people socializing with one another, right? We need a separate system. So these are taken from the slave codes directly from the Commonwealth of Virginia. And the highlighted part, all children born in this country shall be held bond or free according to the condition of the mother. So most of the colonists were English. English common law required heredity pass through the father. That was changed in the colony of Virginia and all the other colonies, right? If my father was a landowner, I would be a landowner. In America, if my mother was enslaved, I was enslaved from birth. The unwritten part of this is what? It provides opportunity for those who owned enslaved people to rape themselves a workforce into existence. Now that's ugly, but that's how it went. Because of this clause here, all children born in this country shall be held bond or free only according to the condition of the mother, meant that if a black woman had a baby, it didn't matter who the father was. That child was born into slavery. Now the flip side of that is that we must then keep white women from having brown babies too, because we can't tell the difference. right? Which is why up until 1967, interracial marriages between black and white people remained illegal in this country. So Loving versus Virginia was the United States Supreme Court case that overturned misogyny laws. There were 17 states in 1967. I was born in 70. So about 2 years before I was created, my parents could not have been legally married in 17 United States states. So sometimes my students go, well, that was a long time ago, wasn't it? I mean, I'm pretty old, but I ain't that old. It wasn't that long ago. There are still people alive now who were socially active, shall we politely say, in the 1960s. I highlighted the important part of this. If any slave resist his master, or others by his master's order correcting him, and by the extremity of this correction should chance to die, that his death shall not be considered a felony. So a slightly different understanding of what a felony is now and was then. This meant that if you killed an enslaved person, you could not be convicted of murder. It's no different than killing somebody's horse, somebody's cow, shooting somebody's dog, right? You can't murder animals. Murder's a legal category. Is it ethical and right to kill animals? Absolutely not. But that's not what we're here talking about. All right? It was legally impossible to murder a black person in the United States. So then when Breonna Taylor is killed in the summer of 2020, and we have a conversation surrounding her killing, and nobody's even charged in her death, I have to correct people. They say she was murdered. She absolutely was not murdered. Right now, I see a direct line from the slave codes to the fact that someone is shot and killed in her sleep, and nobody's even charged with it. I don't know if you all do, but I do. So there have been 3 times across the course of our history where we've almost gotten it together, right? We've almost solved this issue that plagues everybody. Bacon's Rebellion is the first one, right? It didn't take long for poor white folks, poor black folks, free and enslaved, to come together and realize that there was a common enemy. And that common enemy was the elites. It was the planter class, the people who had money, the same rich white dudes that had been running things forever. So there was this rebellion, right? People got together and fought. Power in the hands of those rich white men understood the existential threat that this was, and they put it down harshly. They put it down and made it so that anybody who aided or abetted enslaved people in their escape had to replace them. They put it down so harshly that it didn't happen again for 200 years. Racism was built into America. It's baked into the recipe of what this country is. That's not me saying that this is a racist country. That's this country telling me that its history is that of racism. When you study the history of race relations in this country, you can arrive at no other conclusion. This country was founded by a specific group of people who wanted to advance their own interests at the expense of everybody else's. Those people were wealthy white men. In the beginning, we the people who were mentioned in the Constitution, it wasn't everybody, right? If you were a woman, it wasn't you. If you were poor, it wasn't you. If you were other than white, it wasn't you. We the people was never really supposed to be all of us until later. The franchise, the ability to vote, the ability to affect legislative change was only extended to land-holding white men. Land-holding men, technically, but since nobody who wasn't white could own property, we don't need to specify that. It was there already. Now, white men from some other countries were accepted. England, the Netherlands, Belgium, the Nordic countries. You start sliding down to those browner skinned people in Spain and Italy, right? You start getting to Eastern Europe, people who speak different languages and eat different foods. Those people will allow you some of the benefits of whiteness, but not all of them, right? What whiteness is access to power. And that has expanded and contracted across the first century of what it means to be America. Now, I include this because I've got 4 kids, and one of them really, he's now 19. When he was in middle school, he chose to write an essay about a benevolent slave owner. He had to write an essay for his middle school class about the Civil War, and what he chose was that. Needless to say, that was problematic for me, and we had some interesting conversations about how basically if you own another human being, benevolence doesn't attach, no matter what. But I think a lot of times the history of what the institution of enslavement was is sugar-coated. It's glossed over, right? It's hidden in these key terms, states' rights. And I started hearing this again during COVID, right? This echo of the states' rights to do things that were what their populations wanted, but wasn't necessarily what America wanted. So, okay, let's assume for a moment that that argument is correct, and the Civil War was about states' rights. It's really simple. States' rights to do what? To own other human beings. That's not, again, not me saying this. If you read the Articles of Secession that were authored by the people who decided they did not want to be part of the United States, this is what they said. The highlighted part, our position is thoroughly identified with the institution of slavery, the greatest material interest in the world. Its labor supplies the product which constitutes by far the largest and most important portion of commerce of the earth. They wanted the ability to own people because they wanted the ability to control the money that those people were generating. So when I hear conversations, and this happens more frequently than probably you would believe, about how other immigrant groups come to this country and they had it hard too, and how come? Why is it that black people still experience this discrimination in a way? Why is it that black people still, in every outcome, are on the short end of that stick? You know, my family were discriminated against too. Okay, in purely economic terms, when Russians came here, when Italians came here, when people from Poland came here, what happened to the money that they generated? That money they got to control that, right? When African people were brought here, when black people were born here, irrespective of the fact that they could be created, when they were brought here, who controlled the economic power that they generated? The white families that owned them, that's who. The 14th Amendment established equal protection under law, and the 15th gives all men, just men, sorry women, you still don't get a right to vote, the right to vote. But that represents a challenge to the supremacy of white elites again, right? So we see the black codes put in place. We have Bacon's Rebellion and the slave codes. We have the emancipation at the end of the Civil War, and we have black codes, where racial discrimination becomes the law of the land. Now, we like to pretend that black folk at that time, or the white folk at that time, could choose whether or not to associate with people of color. Understand this. Segregation required separation. It wasn't a choice. There were legal ramifications and punishments for people who transgressed those lines. Right? It wasn't that you could separate yourself from people of color if you chose to. It was that the law required you to. Right? Racial discrimination becomes practice. Validated by the Supreme Court, Plessy versus Ferguson in 1896, which upheld a system which places white citizens preferentially. Social institutions are regulated along racial grounds. Interracial marriage, illegal. Education, interracially illegal. And the substandard education was handed out to children of color. Property ownership, redlining, religion. One of my colleagues at SIU is a scholar of religion, and he will tell you that if you want to see America at its most segregated, check on a Sunday morning. Right? Even now, we don't like each other even when we claim to worship the same God. There are denominations of Christian religion that have been founded simply because certain groups did not want to worship the same God alongside other groups. Right? Jim Crow laws provided legitimacy to a white-advantaged version of this country. This is the third time that we almost got it right. Right? 1954, Brown versus Board of Education, Topeka found that separate is inherently unequal. Duh. We look back at that now and say, well, of course it is. But wasn't that the point? They didn't care if it was equal or not. They just needed to say that it was. Civil rights legislation resulting from that decision is seen by the elites as a challenge to white supremacy. It's taken them until this very year, to start getting those advantages overturned. When the Supreme Court struck down, I forget the name of the decision, I ought to know, when they struck down affirmative action in college admissions, the process has begun. There's a federal judge in Tennessee who has struck down using race as a right to show disadvantage for a small business loan. That'll end up in the Supreme Court. We already know what they're going to do. This is the same court that decided Dobbs. Right? And that's not me being political. That's me knowing as a sociologist that in the case of the Dobbs decision, 80+% of Americans are in favor of some type of access to abortion, and we have a Supreme Court that does not agree with that. Doesn't matter how I feel or anybody else feels about it. The problem isn't what they've decided. The problem is that they have decided against what most Americans want. It's just a matter of time. Okay? The civil rights advantages, the civil rights gains that we saw in the 1960s were founded on equal right to education. That has been undercut. I cannot stress that to you enough. If you don't think that it's all going to be taken apart, you're wrong. They're coming. And I don't mean to sound alarmist, but they're coming. I'm just going to pause and let that sink in for a moment. Seeing it put graphically, I think, helps people understand it. I was born just a little bit into that green area. We can talk about trauma for a minute. Racism is a public health crisis. All right, NIH defines physical trauma as serious injury to the body, blunt force and penetrating. Top picture is Charlottesville, Virginia, 2018. Bottom picture, Ohio, 1909. That's racial trauma. That's what it looks like. SAMHSA defines psychological trauma as results from an event, series of events, or set of circumstances experienced by an individual as physically or emotionally harmful and threatening, and that has lasting effects on the individual's functioning and physical, social, emotional, or spiritual well-being. If racism does not count as that, then I don't know what does. There's no question that racism is a psychological trauma. Racial trauma works like this. W.B. Du Bois, a brilliant sociologist who was denied access to education 120 odd years ago, talked about double consciousness. Right? He talked about understanding himself through the eyes of the others. There's not a single minoritized person in the world that does not recognize what that is. They may not have the words for it. I didn't until I came back to school. But it's the understanding that no matter how I may see myself, other people in our society see me differently. It doesn't matter how educated I am. It doesn't matter how I dress. It doesn't matter how I talk. They see me how they see me, and I have to come to terms with that or I'm going to struggle. Right? That's psychological trauma. The psychological wage of whiteness. When I have these conversations with people, sometimes people think that it's not true. But let me ask you this. You don't have to answer, but in your heart of hearts, as my Nana would have said, if you could choose what your children look like, what do they look like? In our society, it's better to be certain things than other things in terms of outcomes, right? And we're lying if we say that isn't true. It's better to be, for example, a man than it is to be a woman, right? As a man, I have advantage. I have privilege. It's also better to be white than it is to be black. It's better to be straight than it is to be gay. It's better to be wealthy than it is to be poor. It's better to be pretty than it is to be ugly. It's better to be educated than it is to not be educated. But some of these things are out of our control. Nobody woke up this morning and decided what race they were going to be. A couple of notable exceptions that we're not going to get into. But for the most part, most of us are who we are. We didn't ask in the same way that I didn't ask to be part of a group that is oppressed. I don't think that any white folks woke up this morning and asked to be part of a group that's privileged. That doesn't make it any less true. That's the psychological wage of whiteness. A white person who has nothing still has that to hang on to and is not eradicated by financial gain, right? Rich people of color are still people of color, still have to navigate the world in this skin. The richest woman in the world is still going to have her dress choices questioned if she says that she was sexually assaulted. Right? As a man, that's never going to happen to me. Patricia Hill Collins came up with the concept of the insider within. The outsider within. All right? I am part of our society. I'm not part of our society. How many presidents have there been? It's not a trick question. How many presidents have there been? No political science people in there? What? 46. Biden's 46. How many of them have been not white dudes? Really? One? Because his mama was white. Did he feel that he was an insider in Washington? The one not white man that we've had lead this country? I would make the argument that he was the ultimate outsider within. He occupied the rank. Do you all remember when he wore a brown suit and people lost their minds? Right, it's like Hillary wearing that pantsuit, right? That red pants. Like, why does that matter? That's it? That's the thing we're going to talk about? That's that outsider within status. While he may have been nominally the leader of the country, how many times did you hear, not my president? Where I live, in southern Illinois, right? So for those of you who don't know it, Illinois does extend south of 64, right? Also south of 70, right? It does. And where you live, where I live in Saline County, right? And there are so many people there. Well, he wasn't my president. Okay, well, he was. You don't like it, I get it. Peggy McIntosh came up with the concept of the invisible knapsack. Now that's something that's vilified by people on the political right. One of the things she brought up was a flesh-colored Band-Aid. Oh, isn't it nice that I have Band-Aids that match my skin tone? And if that were the only example, then okay, point taken. A Band-Aid, whatever, right? But that's, as we all know, if you look at it seriously, that's not the only thing. That's just an example, right? I tell my students in race and ethnic relations, I will give you an A for the semester if you go to the grocery store and take a picture of the sign that says white foods or white hair care products. Take a picture of that, bring it to me, and I will give you an A for the semester, because there's no such thing. There's no white foods aisle, there's just food. Now there may be a Mexican food aisle, an Asian food aisle, there may be ethnic hair care products, right? But we have this normative whiteness. We have a way in this country of whiteness being the point of departure. How does that impact people? Specifically, suicide rates, and this is pre-COVID information. No, this is accurate going through COVID. Suicide rates have been dropping, except for in the black community. There, we see suicide rates of climbing. APA recognized that African Americans often receive mental health care of poorer quality and often unable to access culturally competent care. What does that mean? What is culturally competent care? It means if I go in to talk to somebody about experiences of racism, I don't want to talk to a white person, because while they may be the most understanding white person ever, they don't know like I know. They don't experience it like I experience it. In the same way that if a woman has experienced something that she needs to get treatment for based on her status as a woman, she doesn't want to talk to a man, usually because it's been a man that's perpetrated that upon her, right? But it's not helpful. This doesn't address the fact that many communities of color are more reluctant to seek care to begin with, much less be able to find it when we choose to. Now, I mentioned in a session earlier today that it's a lack of trustworthiness in the institution that needs to be addressed, not a lack of trust in the patients that needs to be addressed. If we're mental health and physical health care practitioners, we need to understand the problem is us. It's not those people who don't trust us, it's us. We've earned that. Black children between the ages of 5 and 12 have twice the rate of suicide of similarly aged white kids. How's that possible? If we know this to be true, and this is recent literature, it's there, it's true, how is it that this takes place? How is this possible? I wish I had an answer. Black women have higher maternity mortality rates than any other racial group. Non-white emergency room patients are more likely to be skipped over. White medical students believe that black people specifically experience pain differently than white people. This is all recent research, right? This isn't a long time ago where people used to think this stuff, right? People who were residents in 2016 are practicing physicians now. And this is what they've told people when they've been surveyed. The APA apologized for racism in 2021, and so did the AMA. They're a little bit different though, aren't they? The APA, racism has had an incalculable negative toll on the survival, security, health, well-being, and societal participation of generations of people in the U.S. It's a fairly fundamental and basic acknowledgement, but it's nice to read. The AMA, on the other side, it's difficult. For who? We don't want to talk about racism because it's difficult. For whom? These conversations are not difficult. People on the short end of an oppressive structure understand and have these conversations all the time. What they mean to say is uncomfortable for people in positions of power. That's what they mean to say, but they don't quite have the guts to go on record as saying that. It's inferred there. So if they won't even talk about things because it's difficult, how are things ever going to get better? And how do we continue on if as we understand, this is a conversation we were having earlier at our lunch table, and I thank you all for welcoming me and letting me hang out with y'all. If we live in a society, and we do, where racism and racist thoughts and racist practices are socially unacceptable, although I would like to note that since the inception of the Trump presidency, conversations have taken a turn. People are far more comfortable now, and I'm not blaming former President Trump for this, right? But he has fostered an environment in which people feel far more comfortable speaking about things in ways that they would not have done before, right? They don't mind saying things out loud that we used to think were the quiet part. How did this happen? So these policies are deliberate and specific. They're designed and implemented by the elite, who is still rich white men, to disadvantage certain groups. Nixon and Reagan, former presidents of this country, both, right? If you do any type of research on what they thought about social justice, it becomes clear. John Ehrlichman worked for Nixon. They associated crime with poor white people who they termed hippies and blacks. They associated drugs with those two groups. And they deliberately set out to vilify and criminalize these activities every night on the evening news to justify increased surveillance and incarceration of these groups of people, poor white folks and black folk. Lee Atwater, and you can Google him, just Google Lee Atwater busing. Sometimes I'll play it because he's on record as saying some really ugly things out loud. I'm not gonna play it here, right? But he even says, it's on YouTube, he even says, now, y'all don't record me now, or y'all don't quote me now, as he's saying it. And he was an advisor to both Bush and Reagan. So these are people who have access to the levers of power. They have the ear of some of the most powerful men in the entire world. And these are the messages that they've put forward through all this time. Let's talk about President Trump and President Biden. In the summer of 2020, then President Trump tweeted, "When the looting starts, the shooting starts." Now, he's not an intellectual giant, so I'm gonna go ahead and give him a pass and say that he didn't know that those are words that George Wallace used in 1968. But as president of this country, he absolutely should have known, and the connotation of those words. And just so as you don't think this is a political rant, it's not. There's plenty of bigotry to go around. Joe Biden's quote, "Poor kids are just talented as white kids." Well, inherent in that is what? That poor kids are not white kids. That he sees black people, black kids, as somehow different. And then Senator Tom Cotton from Arkansas, who says we have an under-incarceration problem. I've done a little bit of research. I'm somewhat of a, amateur criminologist. For those of you who don't know, this country incarcerates its own people at higher rates than any other nation in the entire world, right? We don't have an under-incarceration problem. Not only do we incarcerate at higher rates than any other country in the entire world, we recidivate. We send people back to prison. We know it doesn't work. We keep doing it though. And then you have a sitting U.S. senator who says, you know what's a good idea? We should lock more people up. We don't have enough people locked up. I don't think he meant everybody. This is, I think, one of the most disturbing things I've ever read. So this is a tweet from John Cornyn last summer on the heels of the Dobbs decision. He says, now du Plessis versus Ferguson / Brown versus Board of Education. In response to former President Obama's tweet, today the Supreme Court not only reversed 50 years of precedent, it relegated the most intensely personal decision someone can make to the whims of politicians and ideologues, attacking essential freedoms of millions of Americans. A sitting U.S. Senator tweeted, now du Plessis versus Ferguson and Brown versus Board of Education. Does anybody know what the Supreme Court precedent would be if we removed those two Supreme Court cases? Anybody? It's Dred Scott, right? Which held that the Negro has no rights that the white man is bound to respect. That was the holding of the court in Dred Scott. If you follow that line of reasoning, that's what that man is asking for. Now, of course, that tweet was taken down. You took it out of context. Ain't no way to take that shit out of context. You said what you said. He backed up a step when he realized that still this country doesn't quite have the appetite for that type of racism. But that's a sitting U.S. Senator who thinks that we should go back to a time in this country where black people literally do not matter. Okay, enough with the doom and gloom. Can we move forward?